This is Mae Brussell, and it's KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, and it's broadcast number 575. If you live here in Pacific Grove, you can hear the chimes outside. The clock tells us what time it is. It's very nice to hear those chimes out here in Pacific Grove. This week, and every week for that matter, is fundraising at this station. There are many people who get these tapes, and they're played on other radio stations, and what I have to say tonight about contributing to this particular broadcast or this station also applies for people out of the state or in the state that have stations that hear this broadcast that I have, but particularly I'm talking about this local station that needs funds, as do most of these public broadcasting stations. Formerly, I was at a privately owned radio station, and I didn't have to ask people to contribute. It's unusual to have to do it, but there are advantages to this kind of a station. There are no commercials at any time, and not only World Watchers, but there's a wide range of music and foreign languages and folk and rock and reggae and poetry and a lot of interesting programs that are scheduled. The station is run by people on no salary at all who donate their individual talents, and each one of them has a listening audience that should be interested in the subject that they particularly are doing, and I've made a commitment to myself to try to raise maybe $1,500 for this station from people that I know. And some of you have been very nice and sent in money, and it's equivalent a little more than $1 a month sent to the station as a subscription, or more if you have more. And tonight there's going to be somebody taking telephone calls, and you can pledge to this station. It's 375-3082. But if you want to wait till the hour is over, I'll answer the phone and take calls. And also, if you have a question you want to ask me and that you want me to put on the air on a particular area of research that you're interested in that you might have missed before you listened to my broadcast or you weren't sure about, whether it's the Jonestown or the murder of rock musicians or the Robert Kennedy assassination or some of these stories that are in the news that are of interest to you. If you want me to do part of a broadcast dedicated to you and your curiosity and repeat for some people who didn't understand or didn't hear it, if you give a donation to the station and have a membership, I'll do a segment next week and the week after and continue for people and do a section of my program for those people that subscribe to the station. If you want information from my research files, I will share it with you. If you are contributors to the station, students are $10 and senior citizens are that price, and regular subscriptions are $15. Sustaining members are $25, and patrons of the airwave are $40. So you can call in 375-3082. But if you don't want to miss part of the program, you can wait till it's over, and I will answer the telephone and speak with you. And if you make a pledge, you can also make a request if you have one. If you're satisfied the way things roll, we'll keep it going that way. But if there's something in particular that you want me to answer, make a pledge, and I'll answer it for you on the air in the weeks that follow. And that way you will get a background on that subject, as well as my sharing this with other people and filling you in on some of those events. This station allows, as I say, a good choice of topics, not only right here in Pacific Grove, but up north, Santa Cruz and Watsonville and Salinas and over the entire area. And there's discussions of movies and of jazz and music and women's subjects. And anything that you want to share is available on this program. So you have to ask yourself, this kind of radio is available now. How many people actually appreciate the freedoms that we have? There isn't a day that I open the newspaper that a new freedom isn't being taken away. And these kinds of things like freedom of press that we had during the anti-war movement, when people were against the war in Vietnam, are no longer here. Do you realize that they went under the Berkeley Barb, the LA Free Press, the newspaper in San Diego that was good, one in Philadelphia? Where have they gone? Well, John Mitchell didn't put them under, and Richard Nixon didn't put them under, and neither did Ronald Reagan or the conservative establishment of the CIA, the Defense Department. They had a COINTEL program. They tried to sabotage these papers. But the main reason they went under was because the people, the so-called liberals who care about society or cared about Vietnam, thought that when Vietnam was over that all the problems in the world were solved. And then they went to such things as self-introspection and improving themselves, which is great. You can do that simultaneously. You can be a vegetarian and still support a newspaper or radio show. You can deliver your own baby and support a radio station or a newspaper. You can make your macrame and your homemade clothes. You can recycle your clothes. You can drop out of the system. You can not have credit cards. That is not being a social, a person of social concern. The ultimate of concern are people like the Abraham Lincoln Brigade that went and fought Franco over in Spain. But there are many areas and many injustices going on today. There's going to be this terrible bloodbath in El Salvador. We saw Laos and Cambodia and Vietnam decimated, and with Agent Orange, and our own people came home with these terrible chemicals and genetic problems with their children. But what makes these things fold up, like radio stations like this and newspapers, that were giving you articles or opportunities to tell what was going on, was the people that should have supported them got lazy. Not the power structure, because I know myself that I was a survivor through the 60s and 70s, and I haven't changed anything. And so far, I'm still here to do what I'm doing, which proves it can be done. And I can still do the things, boycott certain stores, boycott products like Nestle's. If the formula is poisoning people, I can stay away from certain manufacturers or industries. Nestle's chocolate, you can have a Christmas without Nestle's Toll House cookies. You can use Ghirardelli's, but you can look at products and see the fascist links connected to these places. You can boycott these things. You can have a lifestyle, which in effect is a statement. Just as growing hair was a statement, or recycled clothes are a statement. You can have a lifestyle like that, but that doesn't support the people who are telling you what is going on in the world. And every time you hide your head and don't want to know, it gets worse, and it's better to have some responsibility for your own life. And for that reason, I think that you should send in pledges to radio stations, this one in particular, or if they're the same type of station where this is played, support that station. If you're listening to me here in this radius, support this station, because this is where you're getting the news that is really going on. I just got a call from a friend and a co-researcher who lives in Salinas, and she heard on Radio Moscow tonight that Frank Turpel has said that he was working with Mohammed Agca, the man who shot the Pope, that he supplied material for him. You heard that first on World Watchers. You heard that a long time ago. And the propaganda against the Soviet Union and the Bulgarians, even if they were Bulgarians, they could work for the CIA. And the network really belonged in Frankfurt and with the Grey Wolves and the Nazis. And that a murder attempt on the Pope was done to not only to wipe him out for particular reasons at that time that I've discussed, but for the purpose of blaming the Soviet Union for being the Antichrist and having them pass through Bulgaria, and therefore they're the Antichrist. And you have to know who your enemy is. Are these people doing the things we're told they are doing, just as the Gulf of Tonkin was an attack that we had on our own radar system? We were not actually attacked, and we're still paying the debt. We'll never pay off the debt for that war and the other wars that we've had. So the point is that you have to, and you should, do everything you can simultaneously, but you should be supporting station like KAZU. A typical example is Ted Gandolfo in New York, who's been a researcher into the John Kennedy assassination for years, and I've mentioned his name on the air, his tape cassettes that he has available. And he wrote what he called an article. It's not an article. He can't write, but he thought it was an article. And he sent it to about 20 magazines, and they rejected it. And he sent it to magazines like Gallery and Penthouse. He says, where are all the liberals? Well, you don't work with the mob and the syndicate and expect them to give you crumbs or stories on these kinds of things. But it wasn't well written. They turned it down because it wasn't well written. Even those magazines have good articles. So he calls me from New York. He says, do you think Paul Krasner would publish it in The Realist, his article? Krasner went broke 10 years ago, and Gandolfo doesn't know it. Gandolfo is asking me to have Krasner publish his thing. But if he had supported Paul Krasner for 10 years, The Realist would still be here for everybody to publish, just as he published my first 3 articles. If these people were so interested in John Kennedy, they still could take The Realist and read what other people are doing. And I give this as an example that somebody comes out of the woodwork like a Rip Van Winkle and wants Krasner to do something for them, or they'll come to me 5 years from now. Would you put this on the air? If the station doesn't have the money, they won't know it. You see, if you invest in it, you have a part of it, and you can contribute to it. And the point is that we don't wake up years later and say, where is it? It slipped by. The point is, it is here now, and there aren't that many sources of information in the country that are free to all of you. So it's important to remember, write if you want to Box 206, Pacific Grove, California, 93950, or say Mae sent you. And pardon me, keep the subscriptions in the other room until I'm through. Maureen, go out in the other room. We'll finish. And somebody just brought me in a pledge, and I appreciate it. But just close the door, and we'll do it when we're through. We did get a pledge, but I'm not going to read them on the air right now. We can do it later. Now, getting back to, I'll go some more into this subject later, but going back to the format we have had in the past weeks or years, I just want to review quickly what was said 1 year ago tonight to remind you of the kind of material that was on the air. That was broadcast number 523, December the 13th, 1981. I was talking about the world's #1 arms dealer, Samuel Cummings, in London, whose sister is married to Senator John Tower of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Now, Cummings is the man involved with the massive weapons supply that Frank Turple worked with, that worked directly with Frank Turple. So 1 year later, the assassination attempt on the Pope is linked to a man who is a CIA member living in London with his offices in Monte Carlo and had a part in trying to shoot the Pope. I talked about the Randolph Hearst family paying $300,000 settlement over the death of Myrna Opsahl, Opsahl. That was a mother of three, a pregnant woman. Emily Harris allegedly killed her at a bank robbery up in Northern California near Sacramento. And Patty Hearst drove the getaway car. The Hearst paid off. Now, you know, they're not prosecuted for the murder. The husband takes $300,000. You could pay somebody to shoot your wife for $300,000. Here's a woman killed at a bank. The people that killed her are not charged because one of them responsible for the getaway car was Patty Hearst. I mentioned the ex-prosecutor's story, D.A. Browning, in the SLA case, and how Jimmy Carter interfered and wouldn't let him prosecute Jack Scott, who helped with the getaway and drove Patricia Hearst back east after the fire in Los Angeles. The SWAT team killed the other people. Now, D.A. Browning's name is in the news this week. 1 year later, his name is in the news, and it's in a case that is very important. And there's a lot of women in this area and around this area that are involved in the women's movement that are concerned with women's problems. And one of the most important cases involving a woman that's going on in the courts right now involves D.A. Browning. The woman's name is Tina Fishman, and I don't know if you read the story or not. Tina Fishman in the 60s belonged to the anti-war movement. It was very active as a political activist, and she's a member of the Communist Party now and lives in Chicago. She separated from her husband, who's a physicist at Lockheed Missile and Space Company, and D.A. Browning is the attorney representing the husband to take her child away. They took her child away from her a year and a half ago. They admitted that the child was healthy, the child is active, that she has shelter, and they're not arguing. They said that she's not neglected, that she has the right education, she has shelter, but the environment of her mother's politics allows this court, if it's possible, this week to remove the child from this woman. The computer scientist at Lockheed Space Company is going to try this week with D.A. Browning to take the child away from this woman. And her attorney in San Francisco said that this is a case of a political, it's an absolute political extension of the police state. The child's a straight-A student, well cared for. The mother does everything she's supposed to do. And the mother responds, she says her husband, former husband, the father, has the child. He's working for a company that makes cruise missiles, Trident submarines, weapons designed to kill millions of people to maintain a U.S. empire. What kind of environment is that to raise a child in? They're saying that hers is the wrong environment because she is anti-U.S. imperialism and anti-Lockheed missiles and the killer team, and he took her child a year and a half ago, and she's trying to get that child back. And D.A. Browning, the same man that got Jack Scott off for taking Patty Hearst to Philadelphia and worked with Jimmy Carter to see that all that supported her in that great escape weren't prosecuted. The San Francisco Mercury had an article, Browning, a former U.S. attorney who prosecuted Patty Hearst, said his decision to take care of this case was based on evidence of Reva's neglect, not through terms, this is the way it's spelled out, not in terms of food or clothing or shelter or education or tangible necessities. It's neglect because the father is working for Lockheed Missile and the mother's politics as a Marxist are too far left for her to raise her children. Now, this is a very serious thing, and if this goes through, then your child can be plucked from you, and the next person's child is plucked from them. This is the beginning of another vice, and this is the kind of information that you may or may not have read, but a year ago I was talking about D.A. Browning. I also was talking a year ago about Richard Allen and his role in gave the whole biography of Richard Allen, not the whole biography, but certain points about him, and his role in 1960-61 in Freiburg, Munich, and how he came back and in 1962 to 66 founded the Georgetown Center for Strategic and International Studies. He founded it with the money that he brought from Germany and set up this study, and Richard Allen was the national security advisor that left at the time of the scandal of the Japanese money in his drawer and the payoff. Now, this week it was recommended or suggested in the news that Mr. Allen become our ambassador to Bonn, Germany. That's Helene von Daum in Austria and Mr. Richard Allen in Bonn, Germany. And the marriage between the United States government and the Nazi regimes gets closer and closer. And, of course, I had a whole link of Richard Allen's chronology going into his years with Army intelligence and overlapping the Mark David Chapman experiences and the murder of John Lennon. And this is a very important tape in case any of you don't have it, number 532. It was December the 12th, 1981. That's what we were talking about on the air just a year ago today. Now, another reason it's important to appreciate this kind of broadcasting, and I want to share with you maybe in a three-part, the first part tonight, a letter I got from L. Fletcher Prouty. Came out of Alexandria, Virginia. Now, Fletcher Prouty was a liaison of the Air Force, Pentagon to the Central Intelligence Agency. He flew the airplane of very many famous people and generals, and I can give you a rundown of some of the people he's mentioned that he was directly responsible for. Fletcher Prouty wrote the book The Secret Team. And on the cover, it's hard to describe him. He says in this book, and the Secret Team was a group set up by President Truman, established by Congress. The CIA was to gather data. When the Cold War came, the administrations gave it more power, and they set up their own secret group inside of the established intelligence group. And those are the ones that do the massive killings, and he says they're all over the world. He mentions Cuba, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Germany, Hungary. Of course, they were in Iran, and they're in the Philippines and in South Korea, wherever the military dictatorships come, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, you name it, Paraguay, Uruguay, wherever there's military dictatorship, they have done it, like the military junta in Brazil in 1964 or in Dallas, Texas in 1963. Now, Fletcher Prouty in the U.S. Air Force was the official focal point officer for the Air Force for the Defense Department with contacts to the CIA, and he wrote this book, The Secret Team, to alert you, and it's in paperback. You can get it hardbound, paperback at the library, to alert you on how a section was born out of the original CIA of military people, scientists, educators, your teachers, people at high schools, colleges, faculty, business dynamos, intellectuals, so-called economists, became members of the secret team. Now, Fletcher gets a copy of these broadcasts every week. Charles Spears has a secretary who types them up, and he makes copies for many people, and that's a very tedious job to do. And it's one reason I spell these names on the air so they'll get them clear in transcribing these tapes. And Charles sends these out all over the country to very important people. And Hill Fletcher probably gets them every week from Charles Spears. And he wrote me a letter which makes my holidays and makes me feel very good and proud. And I want to share with you what he's saying about this kind of broadcasting and what I'm trying to do and what you can do by listening and helping support this. He wrote this week, December the 8th, May, I would like to write every time I receive one of your, he calls them the articles. They're really the equivalent of a whole article every week. There are many transcribed pages. He says, every time I see them, your tremendous research is so ably augmented by the gift of assimilation and accurate intuition, where so many people see words and hear the ideas they do not see in what they have read and heard, the things that are important. And that is the essence of what is going on. Many people see words and they hear ideas, but they don't see when they read it, and they don't hear what's important. And that's why I reiterated, if you saw it somewhere, and I try to take articles you haven't seen and repeat those. He said, we are the prisoners of our own ignorance and the victims of arrogance of the high cabal. At the same time, we now have at our fingertips the means to make life and living on earth heaven. It was intended to be, and no one will ever find it anywhere else. For our troubles, I do not blame those who have done and are doing all these enormously evil things to us. I blame ourselves. Anyone who would believe what he heard about the many murders around us, starting with John Kennedy, etc., does not deserve any more than he is getting. And that is important, because I feel like Fletcher when I watch TV and these human interest stories and the factories that are closing to go out of the country, and he's given me an economic explanation I'll share with you in a few weeks. I won't do it tonight. But when I see people crying about the conditions now, they don't have this, they don't have that, isn't Reagan terrible? That this is their own ignorance. We had him out in California for 8 years. If anybody wanted to know there was blood dripping off his hands at that time and project what he could do as president, it was all there. He says people that can't figure this out do not deserve more than they are getting. Anyone who cannot see the tremendous opportunities afforded us by the development of production capabilities and the gift of computers today doesn't deserve more. It is all in our hands, and we do so little about it. And that is true. We do so little about it. If I asked you, maybe at the end of each broadcast, if there were 100 people listening or 1,000 people that listen and get these tapes and hear the broadcast, if each one sent $1, you know this station would be home free for all the airtime or the people. If everybody just put in an envelope $1 a week, not a membership, do you know that they'd be just fine and dandy? And no hard candy Christmas on top of it, okay? That's all it takes. It's in our hands, and we do so little. What he said in the letter is what makes your work so important. This makes it important. If minds cannot be opened, then not much else can follow. And the assumption of people not wanting to open their minds or to contribute is that if the bomb falls, we'll all die anyway. The bomb may fall and you may have half your skin, or like that child in Vietnam that was on TV recently whose body was in flames with napalm that time. You may not be the survivor, but you may have the napalm. So Fletcher is recognizing that this is important, and I know it's important, and I want to share it with you because I don't mind the criticism or suggestion. I like suggestions, and I will take criticism from a peer group who's read the same material I've read and understands it. But there are a lot of smart aleck people who say, oh, you don't believe this, you don't believe that, and they don't want to put their own investment into the things that are published, the things that they hear, to try to understand it. I'm not sure they're capable of it, but assuming they're capable of it, give them the benefit of any doubt because there's not much time left. It is very important. And as I say later, I will, if you want to call 375-3082, we'll take the question from you, and then during the weeks that follow, I'll answer it on the air. And then he wrote a joint letter to Charles Spears in Texas and to myself, which he also said, and he said, Mae and Charles, this is a good date to be writing a letter about some important things. The two of you have been doing such a superlative job that I just have to tell you from time to time how great it is. Nothing is more important today than to have people using their heads and then doing what they can to see that others understand with them. You both deserve my congratulations to the fullest. I thought I'd send you a few thoughts on some work I've been doing, and that I will share with you. One is on the Nuganan Bank and Edwin Wilson and what happened there, and the other is why the country is bankrupt, and it directly overlays the work and the research I've done. He understands that perfectly, and it is a compliment to get a letter from him because he is one of the highest people in the Pentagon and the CIA who left there and acknowledges the fact that we are doing something and that we're on the right track. And if you want to stay on that track and follow these events, again, send to this station or send a letter, Box 206, Pacific Grove, 93950, and say, Mae told you to send in and that you appreciate this kind of broadcasting. Now, last week I was talking about Peter Drucker, the man who invented Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer. This is the man who brought Fritz Kramer to this country, and Fritz Kramer invented Henry Kissinger, every bit of it. Well, just as of interest, this month in Psychology Today, December 1982, there's an article, a conversation with this same Peter Drucker, Peter F. Drucker. He is the leading management consultant to the multinational corporations. He worked for General Motors, John DeLorean's company. He worked for Ford Motor Company. DeLorean's dad had worked at Ford. There's a book about him, a biography called Drucker, The Man Who Invented Corporate Society, published by Warner, 1977. It came out. And he tells about his value in corporations. He takes them and teaches them how to merge and how, pardon the expression, to rape all of us, I won't use the other words, take us over the coals, but how the multinationals and the business corporations can work and merge and accumulate the capital and leave us with barely the utilities to pay at the end of the month, while somehow or other their profits keep going up, and maybe it won't always escalate if there's a massive depression. But he's the man who is managing the businesses while Henry Kissinger manages the corporations. Now, Kissinger is on the board of ABC Broadcasting now. He's been put on the board of CBS. He's at Fox Studio. Alexander Haig got promoted now to the board of MGM Studio. I'll do more about that later. He has gone on to, it's a full cycle from the Jewish immigrant, the family of Louis B. Mayer, who wants to make it big, you know, the little yid that comes to Hollywood, builds a big studio, goes to bed, not literally but figuratively, with Herbert Hoover and with Randolph Hearst and all their Nazi friends, and with his Ida Koverman, the secretary, who was Hoover's secretary, and brings in all the fascist mentality and Jack Warner to Hollywood that any two people could do. This isn't a Vatican problem or a Protestant problem either. These people just went with the fascist element. They had no foresight. Now the studio, I knew Louis Mayer, grew up practically around that studio. Now Haig is on the board of directors. It's a different game with Mr. Kerkorian and Mr. Rothman. But the man, Peter Drucker, who made these corporate giants, has Henry Kissinger and Haig, his two puppets, out in Hollywood. And, you know, Adolf Hitler knew very well what to do with the studios and how to use the motion pictures for propaganda. In this article, it also tells how Drucker does non-government work. He advises the government, but he works for a wide range of institutional clients, from the Girl Scouts to Christian denominations. And that's where I think the missing millions and billions is going, that he's sapping and putting these corporations into debt, and it's going into the Christian denominations and the electronic Christian churches. So Peter Drucker, born in Vienna, educated in Frankfurt, went to school with Fritz Kramer. He brings Kramer to this country where he links up with Henry Kissinger. He puts him in Harvard. And this man is the head of the corporate know-how, with his two puppets really making decisions in countries and places that rule the world. Now, the corporations are in trouble because they have canvassed away or put in the Swiss banks for their safety and given loans and money that we can't touch. They know where it is, in offshore banking in the Cayman Islands and so forth. They have salted away a lot of money, as have churches like the Vatican with their $1.2 billion in Panama, and they won't tell where it went. Although the newspaper today, the San Francisco Chronicle, said $50 million went to Lech Walesa. Well, I said before, Solidarity was a farce. Walesa was a front. He was put in by the CIA, the FFL-CIO, the same group that overthrew Allende and had the bloodbath in Chile, with Killer, Haig, and Kramer and Kissinger behind that. It didn't work because the Russians are smarter than us, see, and they stopped the Solidarity, probably took the $50 million worth of weapons, and so it goes. Now we're going to take a 1-minute break here, and for those of you that record this program off the air, and stop it now. In this room, and I it registered that it was playing, but I don't think it was playing. So the pause was off. So we'll continue with the second half of this broadcast and take care of that later. The news this week had information on John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Mary Jo Kopechne. It's very seldom that you get news items on those four murders in 1 week, but I guess that's the karma of Rush Harp, who passed away a few weeks ago. He's the fellow who had thousands of postcards made, maybe 100,000. Who killed JFK, RFK, MLK, MJK? JFK's John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Mary Jo Kopechne. And he had a photograph of himself in front of this sign, not LHO, that's not Lee Harvey Oswald, not JER, and he had the people that we said did these murders, whether it was Sirhan, SBS Sirhan, or James Earl Ray, or EMK as Edward Kennedy, not those people. He had some notes down below. Well, this week, he's been passed away about a month ago. The karma must be there. We always used to talk about karma, so I'll do those news stories for you. And I also will be asking you again to, at the end of the hour, if you want to call in, I'll take questions from you and answer them on the air if you donate to the station. Now, one of the most obscene articles this week in the newspaper was from the New York Times, Kennedy assassination site to become a museum. That's okay. But what they're going to do in Texas is they're going to take the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, which the authorities say was the site from which President Kennedy's fired a rifle. The New York Times has it wrong, from which Lee Harvey Oswald fired the rifle, they said. It will be converted into a museum to commemorate this slaying of John Kennedy. The Dallas County Historical Commission set aside $3 million to put a museum on the 6th floor. So if you bring your family or children to Dallas, you will see the 6th floor museum where they said the rifle and Lee Harvey Oswald work clipboard were discovered on the southwest corner of the floor. I'm sure they're not going to tell you if you visit there that the rifle had no fingerprints and that there was no indication that this shot came from that window. This was all set up. This was not an accurate story. The fatal headshot came down by the grassy knoll. That's not where the museum is going to be for all time. And if you put $3 million into a museum, then the history is set. Anybody who goes there will be told that Oswald was at that lair. Even the House Select Committee on Assassinations, when they spent $3 or $4 or $5 million on Martin Luther King and John Kennedy's assassination, ended up with a conspiracy and a shot over at the grassy knoll. And the ballistics, the weaponry, the capability of Oswald's gun, the way the bullets went, the amount of bullets, the trajectory of the bullets, the direction of the president's head, everything came from the ground. But by building a museum on the 6th floor, it would be very hard to change that museum once you've put $3 million into the 6th floor. That is the most massive brainwashing job I've ever heard about. Then there was a movie on television, The Rise and Fall of Rosemary Clooney. And this was this past week. And she tells about her career in singing and her long struggle with drugs, with Hollywood, and starting with pills and Valium and Librium and Percodan and Seconal, so forth. Rosemary Clooney, according to a description of the broadcast, was on TV this week, hit the bottom following the collapse of her marriage and her friend and hero Robert Kennedy when he was assassinated. I heard her say on television, she was talking about this broadcast coming up, and she said she was in the Ambassador Hotel when Robert Kennedy was shot. It decimated her life. She freaked out. Now, who knows if she saw Sirhan, or what happened. You see, there were people like Ted Chirac in the Ambassador that saw Thane, Cesar, having a gun fall to the ground, and the trajectory of the shot coming from the back of the head, which is what the autopsy said, and Thane Cesar, the guard from Lockheed, who now allegedly, I heard, runs a Nazi party out in not in Bakersfield, down in Riverside. And it's very active down there. She, according to what she said, she was in the Ambassador. It was so traumatic for her. Nothing was left for her but the grim walls of a mental hospital. And this is where her story begins and unfolds. So from the Ambassador Hotel, and Robert Kennedy had dinner with Sharon Tate that night before he went to the Ambassador, and Roman Polanski, Rosemary Clooney was there, and then she gets the pills, and then the mental hospital, and maybe electroshock, so that her whole struggle with this scene came when Robert Kennedy was shot, her friend, and maybe her memory was erased. Maybe she was at the wrong place at the wrong time, and therefore her memory was erased. Maybe something happened to her. They were anxious to put her into a mental hospital. Following that, that is when her troubles began. Now, as far as Martin Luther King, there was a story, the motel where Martin Luther King was assassinated is up for sale. It's running down. It's in the black part of town. They've used it for prostitution. They haven't kept it up. It's worth very little. They sort of desecrated the place. Now a group of black civil rights leaders want to get the hotel and keep it. Blacks own the hotel, and the newspaper said even after the white-owned hotels and motels opened to the blacks, Martin Luther King chose to stay at the black-owned Lorraine. He was here to support a strike. Now, the Lorraine Motel is up for sale this week. The truth was that Martin Luther King didn't choose to stay at the Lorraine Motel. He chose to stay at the Holiday Inn Motel, and the FBI sent memos just before he was murdered. They were on the scene reporting to J. Edgar Hoover, who hated Martin Luther King and who obviously had the job to murder him. And the FBI reports they suggested neutralizing and killing him and replacing with another leader. So March 29th, they had a record that he was to stay at the Holiday Inn. So they ran a newspaper story, an article. The fine Hotel Lorraine in Memphis is owned and patronized exclusively by Negroes, but Martin Luther King didn't go there for his hasty exit. Instead, King decided the plush Holiday Inn Motel, owned and operated almost exclusively and patronized, telling the black people, boycott the black stores, boycott the white merchants, but he was to stay at the white hotel. And they had an article that J. Edgar Hoover worked out a hypocrisy story to publicize the hypocrisy of Martin Luther King going to the very high-class Holiday Inn instead of the Negro Hotel in Memphis. So he was coaxed by some Judas in the crowd to change his room reservations. It was April 3rd, 1968. The FBI sent another message that they were handling the case, which means they got his reservation changed, and somebody goaded him. You can't have a strike against white people. If you're staying at a white hotel, you have to go to the Lorraine Motel where the arrangements were made, and that's where the assassin was to blow his head off. They very nicely had it at a black hotel and embarrassed him to be there, and the FBI arranged that. They had press information about it. They knew about it ahead of time, and he didn't choose that. His so-called advisors that worked, or informers with the FBI, got him to the Lorraine Motel, and that's what happened to him. Then Ted Kennedy threw in his effort, if it was an effort. He was going maybe to run for president against Ronald Reagan, but there was a very interesting article called Guns and the Man, Kennedy Plays It Safe. This was in the San Jose Mercury. Some of you may or may not have seen it, and also part of it was in the New York Times. Ted Kennedy, they asked him about would he run, or why he gave press conference he wasn't going to run, would he run in the future date? And then there was a comment of Kennedy. He says this guy Mondale might not make it in 1984, the senator was told, that if he wanted, but you will definitely not make it. Mondale might not make it, but you will not get it. And Kennedy replied, I don't know about that. And then the answer was, there's only one way for you to really do it. Someone told him, forget the index cards, the big speeches, run on what's inside of you. Run on your heart and your soul and your stomach. And Ted Kennedy said, I can't do that. Why not, he asked. The guns, he said. The guns, the guns, the guns. And that was his answer. This was reprinted in several newspapers. And the point is that then Ted Kennedy said there's only so much a person to do. Kennedy knows it is largely left to fate, and too much of it to the demons that lurk in the dark impulses of faceless strangers' minds. Now that is where the character flaw is. The demons are not lurking somewhere. The decisions are not left to fate. The decisions are made in the Defense Department and in the White House and the National Security Council and the Committee of 40, which is 5 scumbags. They decide who kills. John McCone, former director of the CIA, lives on this peninsula over at Pebble Beach. If he listened to this program, he'd be the first to agree the decisions aren't made by demons, unless you call those people demons that lurk. They're not demons, and they're not faceless. They have names. One of the people that hid the murderers died this week, Leon Jaworski, and I'll do a little bit about that scumbag. Goodness knows what he was thinking when he was chopping wood. He and Reagan, if they can't chop heads and the guillotine isn't in, they chop wood. They're out there chopping wood. But there are people, they have names like Alan Dulles and John McCloy or Leon Jaworski covering it up, and these people, Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and Theodore Shackley, the people that planned Kennedy's murder, you could list 100 of them and 100 who covered it up. They're not faceless, and they're not strangers. And Ted Kennedy is playing a stupid game by saying they're faceless, and they're strangers. Another article in the newspaper, Chappaquiddick memories linger. It is true, by 1988, the death of Mary Jo Kopechne in 1969 will be a long time from when she died. The death will be a long time ago. But she will still be dead, and Kennedy will still have to explain 9 hours that it took to call the police. All the debts rest there. There's another article in the newspaper. Is it true that Tony Lasowitz of the White House plumbers, Richard Nixon's right-hand man, private detective, went to Monaco to investigate whether Ted Kennedy had any role in the death of Princess Grace? That's pretty far out. And the answer is no. That's a ghoulish joke you're hearing, but Lasowitz was at the scene of Chappaquiddick, and he posed as a reporter for 4 days to ask Ted Kennedy embarrassing questions at press conferences, and Ted Kennedy said he can't run because of the inquiries about Chappaquiddick, but he's too chicken to say anything about what went on. And furthermore, it's an interesting thing, the decision not to run. He went off to a Greek island, and he allegedly went with, there's a picture of a female he was with, and also a man who accompanied him was John Tunney. And it's when he came home, he ran for the election of the Senate, he won it. He went to Greece with Tunney and with this woman, and then he came home and immediately said, I will not run for president. Now, in the Beyond the Gemstone Files that Bruce Roberts put together, he talks about the accident in quotes, at Chappaquiddick. In 1979, in July, the accident, Mary Jo Kopechne had been working first with John Kennedy, later with Bobby Kennedy. And when she was working on papers of Robert Kennedy's after his assassination, she read about Kennedy and the mafia involvement, and she said, this isn't Camelot, this is murder. And then she was concerned with what's going on. And she went to Chappaquiddick Island and overheard conversation, and she wanted to get off. And according to Bruce Roberts, the man who was calling Ted Kennedy at Chappaquiddick was John Tunney, former senator, and he was talking to Joe Alioto in San Francisco and John Tunney, and the Democratic bigwigs, and the Gemstone File mentions them. And it mentions Cyril Magdon, my father's first cousin, Alioto's friend, and that can of worms, and John Tunney. And at the island of Chappaquiddick, he was talking politics to these people. And Mary Jo Kopechne, according to Bruce Roberts, heard a lot about what was going on, and had Mary Jo's nose was broken. She was waiting in the car 2 hours before she was officially drowning. There was an air pocket, and Ted Kennedy called Cardinal Cushing to help him, and Burke Marshall, a friend of Aristotle Onassis. Again, they were thick with people over in the Greek islands, and Burke Marshall has locked up the evidence for the researchers on John Kennedy's assassination and kept that a secret, and now he was keeping the Chappaquiddick thing secret. In fact, Bruce Roberts said that John Tunney's sister, her name is Joan, heard her brother's end of the phone conversation made from her home in Tiburon in California to the Chappaquiddick cottage. The next day, after Mary Jo was dead, Joan ran away. She went to Norway. She was kidnapped by mafia hoods named Mari and Adamo. They locked her in Marseille in a heroin factory for 60 days. They turned her loose. Joan's husband complained. They cut his head off. This is all true. His head had been cut off with an axe, and she was locked up, eventually locked up in a nut house belonging to the Marquis de Blandford. And then Mari and Adamo, the guys that kidnapped her, were put into metal in a New Jersey auto junkyard a la Jimmy Hoffa style. There was a whole series of deaths around John Thane, his sister's kidnapping, the husband's death, the men who kidnapped her, their deaths. It was a horrendous series of murders that followed the Chappaquiddick affair. And so who was with Ted Kennedy when he was in Greece on a couple of days vacation? The same John Tunney. The same names keep coming through every year, or you get these new incidences where the names reappear in a new shape, taking new trips together and so forth, like Tunney and Ted back to the Greek islands. And this is where his connections were at the time of the Chappaquiddick with Aristotle Onassis and Jackie Onassis, who was over there, and he's been awfully close to her. Now, a man that I wanted to talk about more this evening, but we'll get back to it later, and also the new evidence on the shooting of the Pope, I'll do that next week, is Leon Jaworski. And before I do this, Leon, I'll do some background on Leon Jaworski for the next 10 or 12 minutes. I want to remind you that this is a pledge week here at KAZU-FM. 375-3082 if you want to make a phone call. If it's a toll call and long distance, write Box 206, Pacific Grove, California, 93950. And if you want me to devote a section of a broadcast to things that you want to know in return for your pledge, I'll be glad to do that. And that way, people call my house and ask me, what do you think of this? What do you think of this news event or that? From now on, I'm going to say, make a pledge, and I'll answer your question, because I've always done my work free. We're not paid at this station, and none of my research, I don't make any money off the tapes. They're done at a commercial place. I donate my time, but you can give to the station, and I will give you my information, because I believe it's that important. I don't charge you, and I never did, for anything that I did. And if you listen already, and if you made a pledge already, and many of you did, then I always talk to you and copy any articles you want, and I get letters from you, and we exchange back and forth, because we have that rapport. The World Watchers are a group that do exchange information. And, before I get to Leon Jaworski, I want to mention something that was in my mind when I took the name World Watchers. It used to be called Dialogue Assassination and then Dialogue Conspiracy. But one day, and it was a couple of years ago, Jean Nidetch, Nidetch, who formed the Weight Watchers, sold her corporation. And she sold it for $72 million. She lost 72 pounds and on a diet given out by the city of New York. And she sold her corporation for $72 million. And at the time, I was thinking, at the end of the month, I'm down to like minus $2 or $4, or juggling things around to make the end of the month before the next barrage comes. Okay, and so you can get this book or this article or pay the necessities of whatever it is. And I thought about Jean Nidetch. She had a plan where she got together with a group of women, 6 women, who were they were fat, so it means they were overeating calories. They could give it, say, to Paul Krasner's Realist or the Village Voice or not the Village Voice, but the LA Free Press or the Berkeley Barber, these other areas. They were eating so much that they were overweight. So they decided they'd get together once a week. And if you join Weight Watchers, which I've done, and I've lost weight on that program at different times, you have a membership like $12, or like you join Kazoo, it's $15. Okay. Now they pay $5 every week, whether they gain or lose. And if you go out of town, you still pay. And whether you come or go, it's a 16-week contract, and it's $5 a week for 16 weeks. And you get weighed, and then they discuss whether you should eat tofu or steak, or whether peas have more calories than string beans, or whether tapioca has more calories than fresh pineapple. And the point is that everything that you need to know is free in a library, free from the government, any calorie book. Okay. But the camaraderie of 6 people getting together and figuring out how to lose weight began another group of 6 people getting together, figuring out what to do. Somebody asked me this evening earlier why I'm not writing a book. And I said the only books that sell now, and I read this from the Publisher's Journal, was books on self-improvement, on diets and recipes, and that kind of thing. Those are the major categories, recipes or self-improvement, jogging, running, stretching. I think of writing a book on how I cook 3 days a week for a family, 2 hours a day, and how you can cook for the whole week in 6 hours. That book would sell, and then you'd have money for the station or research, right? But why don't some people do get these tapes and they have discussion groups. Why can't they sit around and have people in and have friends in common, or change your friends, and have discussion groups where each one puts in so much a week, and you sit in your home one night a week. There are people that are not as interested in the news, such as taking a child away from a woman because it's perfectly taken care of, but her politics aren't as good as the husband who works for the missile base at Lockheed. Why aren't there more people forming a group of world watchers? So I had a vision, instead of Weight Watchers, that they would turn to world watchers, which is ridiculous, because people don't want to know how the president of the Democratic Party was murdered or how the senator was murdered. Somebody called me today, wanted me interested, get me active in the Democratic Party. They said, you listen to Kazoo? No. I said, forget it. I talk about the Democratic Party all the time. If the candidates are worth having and the candidates are murdered, then you don't have a party. If you don't know who murdered them, you don't have a party. If you want your freedom, you have to invest your time, whether it's an hour a week or so much a week. And I would hope someday that maybe there would be groups that would have world watchers where they evidently have the money. They're still pouring it in. Hunt Foods bought Weight Watchers, $72 million to watch 20 or 30 pounds go from each person. Some have more. But world watchers could be equivalent to Weight Watchers if people knew that their Earth, they don't know where to put the pollution from 40 years of atomic waste. We bailed out Brazil today, and we don't have money for Social Security. There is no provision for your future, and there's no interest except in jogging around and getting high on the oxygen exchange or whatever it is you get out of it. So if you want to start a group and contribute those dues to this station under the term of World Watchers, that would be fine. Count your calories without giving it to the corporations that took it over, and do it that way. Now, in the last 6 minutes, I do want to talk about Leon Jaworski, who died this week chopping wood. Texas lawyer, Watergate special prosecutor. He was a prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials, which was so important because, with the exception of a handful, all of them got off and are running the corporations today. He allegedly, he did force Richard Nixon to surrender 64 tape recordings, but what he did was he took the call from Alexander Haig, again, Fritz Kramer's protege. It was Alexander Haig that hired Leon Jaworski, who brought in Gerald Ford of the Warren Commission. Leon Jaworski got a call. According to the New York Times, his involvement began, and I have many articles on this, with a call from Alexander Haig, then Nixon's chief of staff. How did he become chief of staff? Fritz Kramer put Haig as the chief of staff of the White House, and these were during the horrendous years. You know what went on during this time period. Jaworski was responsible for the plans to pardon Nixon, and Gerald Ford did it officially. Jaworski said, I told Haig, every person criminally involved should be prosecuted. He's lied from the time he first got out of the Bar Association. Big lie. Chappaquiddick was Tony Lasowitz and the White House plumbers and that group involved around Richard Nixon. They had all the Chappaquiddick material in the White House that they took out and weren't charged with taking the files of E. Howard Hunt after they were arrested, or while they were looking for him. Criminal material they threw in a river and destroyed. The ITT investigation he debated about, didn't go into. The Howard Hughes affair he didn't touch. The Dorothy Hunt plane crash, the murder of a primary witness who was bagwoman for these people. The Martha Mitchell injection where she got her cancer. You think you're home free, you're politically active, get in a hospital, or get a needle in your behind and you get the Martha Mitchell or the Jack Ruby cancer. None of these were prosecuted. He left Washington. People in Washington resented some of them that he left without indicting Richard Nixon. He, according to one LA Times article, within the special prosecutor's office, Jaworski stood alone. That's why Richard Nixon is big man in New Jersey, riding around the country, giving interviews all over the world, along with Haig and Kissinger and Kramer's babies and proteges, this Nazi Kramer, because Jaworski let him off the hook. But that comes from a history way back, and incidentally, he was Lyndon Johnson's attorney, Crook Johnson. Can you imagine being the attorney? In 1960, Lyndon Johnson was being sued by several Republicans because he wanted to run for the Senate the same time he was going to run as vice president under John Kennedy. So if Kennedy lost the election to Richard Nixon, he would still be in the Senate. But if Kennedy won the election, he'd become the vice president. So that he was sued by some Republicans, but Jaworski won that, and Crook Lyndon got on that. Now, I only have time to do one or two things on Jaworski, 1 minute on that. There's a book, and then I'll do more next week. We'll go right into Leon Jaworski. The Killing of Corporal Kuntz by Wilma Parnell, Parnell, by Robert, and with Robert Tabor, written in 1981. It's the story of Leon Jaworski's role in hanging 5 men in an American prison during the war that were not responsible for crushing the head of a person in this prison. It was a scandal. 40,000 Germans were brought to Oklahoma alone in barbed wire. 40,000, while our men were out there in the battlefields and dying in the battles, and London was bombed. And well, I don't have to go into what was going on during World War II. 40,000 were in Oklahoma. One man, Johannes Kuntz, K-U-N-Z-E. His first name is Johannes, K-U-N-Z-E. He missed his wife and children. He was killed by the SS directly in the prison. And this book tells how the United States Army needed a scapegoat, and Leon Jaworski was the prosecutor. And these 40,000, there were people, Germans also, in addition to the 40,000, at Fort Sill, Fort Reno, Will Rogers Field, and then out in California and Texas, Arkansas, Mexico, Texas, Louisiana. And the prison was run by the Gestapo, the SS Gestapo. The Nazis ran their seminars under the guise of innocent, innocuous study classes. Now, that's what Fritz Kramer was teaching Nazism to Henry Kissinger in basic training in Army intelligence. They were conducting political seminars, the Nazis, 40,000 of them in Oklahoma prison in 1943, study classes. The men were disciplined. They were severely beaten. If they fraternized with the enemy, which are the Americans or people that didn't like Hitler, or if they questioned the Nazi doctrine, they were punished. And the Gestapo ran the American prisons for the German prisoners in this country. And this particular person had his head crushed in a terrible murder, and 5 people were charged. It was a military court run by Leon Jaworski. There was violence also in Fort Chaffee, Arkansas, which is where Mark David Chapman was before he shot John Lennon. And this book tells about Jaworski not hanging the people that did the murder and saying you have to understand it was a wartime condition. The book tells about the 5 defendants neither murdered Kuntz nor had anything to do with it. Unidentified assailants did, but they got off free. They smashed his skull. Leon Jaworski was the prosecutor who hung the innocent people, which was exactly what they were doing in Germany. He also was the investigator at Dachau, where Nazi Fritz Kramer came to this country. They've been working together since World War II, since 1943, if not before. Kuntz was killed. Leon Jaworski was in charge. There were secret trials, secret transcripts. The 5 brutal men who crushed this man's head, because he wasn't pro-Adolf Hitler Gestapo in an American prison, the 5 who were, they couldn't explain where the man was killed or who was there. They were hung, and Jaworski hung them and explained that in the hysteria of war you do these things. How in the heck was this going on? I wasn't even aware of these things. Were you? I mean, 1943, I was a senior in college at Stanford, about ready to get married, and I knew from nothing. Some of you get discouraged that you think I have a lot of material and information. Remember that I didn't start my actual research till I was 40 years old. I'm 60 now, so that you still have time to get in on it, okay? Now remember, send your pledges to this station. You can call me at the house and pledge it. I'll be here for an hour to take calls. If you have a question, send in and pledge, and then I'll do your question on the air in the weeks to come so that you'll know it's answered. This is Mae Brussell in KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.